What's up, makers? Mike Clifford here, and this time on Industrial Maker, I'm going to show you how I made this bench with blue concrete legs and a plywood and curly maple top. Now, this was a remote design collaboration with my buddy Jonny over at Jonny Builds, and we wanted to see if we could take the same form for a bench and make it look completely different by changing the materials. So he made a similarly shaped bench out of a live edge slab and steel legs. So check that video out when you're done with this. For now, let's get going and make this bench.
Big shout out to this video's sponsor, Rockler Woodworking. We're going to see a lot of their tools and products I'm using during this build. I've seen a bunch of benches and tables that I really like that use 2-inch steel tubes to make the legs, and I've had this idea for a while to try to recreate something like that, but out of concrete. Clearly there are challenges to working with concrete that you don't have with steel, because you're talking about a 2-inch by 2-inch tube. The strength is not going to be the same as with steel, but with GFRC I was pretty sure it would work, and so this project is an experiment to try that out. One nice thing when you're using melamine for concrete is that you can actually reuse some of the melamine pieces for multiple concrete projects. Here I'm just using a scraper to remove old concrete and glue from the form so that I can reuse the base in this project. The form is just going to be a melamine enclosure in the shape of the legs lying on their side. To make it easier to lay out the side walls of the form, I just used a straight edge and right angle tool to mark out the shape of the legs on the base of the form. The next step was to cut all the side walls for the form, and because there were some non-90 degree angles, I had to measure those and figure out how to miter them. Now, the reason you want to miter all the edges of the form is so that the inside will be entirely the plastic melamine surface and not have any of the insides of the melamine exposed, which would cause the concrete to stick and you'd get an odd pattern in the concrete itself. I decided to make the legs 2.5 inches wide by 1.5 inches tall. Because of these dimensions, it would be really difficult to reach inside the form and wax after it was assembled, so I decided to wax all the pieces before assembling the form. Once I laid out all the pieces of the form, I just used a hot glue gun to go around the outside and make sure that the pieces were set in place. I could then go back with a silicone caulk gun on the inside and a metal ball tool, as I always do, to caulk the insides. And in case you're wondering, yes, the hot glue and the silicone caulk is plenty to hold the pieces in place for a form this size. I then used a hole saw to cut out some circles from pink foam insulation, which I then wrapped in electrical tape and super glued to the inside of the form at the top. These would create some recessed cavities that I could use to insert bolts to attach the concrete legs to the top, and because the bolts would be inside the recessed circles, you won't see them protruding from the top of the legs. Next, it was time to mix up the glass fiber reinforced concrete mix, and I just used the premix that I've used in a lot of my videos and added just a small amount of blue concrete pigment, because I obviously didn't want it to be as blue as that pigment is itself. I wanted more of a pastel light blue. And you see here I'm dry mixing the ingredients because I want to have it evenly mixed, so I can now set aside a little bit that I can use later to do a second face coat on the inside part of the legs that will match the color of the rest of the legs. In my last video, I went in depth on the process for mixing glass fiber reinforced concrete. So if you want more details on the process, definitely go check that video out. And for the bench legs, I actually used a pretty heavy dose of glass fibers, about 0.8 pounds for about 30 pounds of mix, because you really did need these to be strong. this project, with the concrete being blue, I was actually okay with a little bit rougher look with maybe a few more air bubbles in the surface so that you could tell it was concrete. And so I decided not to do a face coat. I just filled the forms by hand, and I did leave a little bit on the back side because it's hard to get the back nice and flat. So after filling the forms with the glass fiber mix, I went back with what I normally use a face coat for and just used that on the back of the legs. I then attempted to hand trowel the back surface to get it flat, and quite frankly, I didn't do a great job. So if anyone has any tips for hand troweling, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Since I didn't do the greatest job hand troweling the back side of the legs, I went ahead and used diamond hand sanding pads to sand the backs up to 400 grit. And then it was time for what I kind of think of as concrete Christmas, removing the form and seeing what you've got underneath. The edges of the concrete can be really pretty sharp when they come out of the form, so I used the diamond hand sanding pads at 200 grit just to make a few passes and round over the edges. After removing from the form, I just wet sanded with 400 grit sandpaper by hand, and if you see my videos, you know that this is my go-to finishing for concrete. Super quick, super easy, and especially in a case like this where I didn't use a face coat on most of the sides, it can remove material slowly so you don't have the risk of the fibers showing through the surface, which is a look I really don't like. And then it was time for the last step on the legs, applying the sealer. And I just used an acrylic sealer that wipes on really easy, takes about 5 minutes, and super simple.
If this plywood glue up looks familiar, there is a reason why. This is the one I made when I was making my pixelated river bench a few months ago and had all kinds of problems with the epoxy, and I thought I was gonna have to scrap the whole thing and start over. I didn't, fortunately, and so now I've still got this glue up and I'm gonna make use of it. Check out that video if you want to find out how the glue up was done, but otherwise, let's get going, cut down this glue up to make the bench top for this bench.
When I pulled this out of storage, I quickly realized that the edges were wavy because I'd used thin 1/2-inch plywood and hadn't been careful enough about over clamping during the glue up. So I'm gonna need to cut those edges straight, and before I do that, I'm gonna need to sand the top flat. Now I'm using a sander in an orbit mode here to remove most of the excess glue squeeze out from the glue up before I put it through the planer, because all that excess glue can be really harsh on your planer blades, and so you can really prolong their life by using the sander first. Next, I use Rockler's bench cookies with T-track risers to get the panel up away from the surface and gripped nicely so that I could use my track saw to cut one side straight. And I also just want to say, these bench cookies and their accessories have been a huge game changer in efficiency. I find so many ways to use them. Being able to get work pieces off the table and sturdy without a clamp is just so useful in so many situations. I could then use the straight side I cut with the track saw as a reference against the table saw fence so that I could cut the other side straight and parallel. While I was at the table saw, I also cut a couple strips of curly maple that were longer than the length of the bench. So let me back up a second and explain these maple strips. When I trimmed the sides to straighten them, I actually made the top narrower than the span of the concrete legs. And so I needed to add these strips back to expand the width of the bench so it fit the legs properly. And this again is not a necessary thing. It was a result of my mistake over clamping the glue up. But I really liked the finished look that the maple edges ended up giving, and so it was kind of a happy mistake. I then got the planer back out one more time to bring the maple strips on the sides level with the rest of the top. Once the top was flat, I could use my track saw, and you could also use a circular saw, of course, to cut down the bench to its final length. I used the Rockler T-Track clamps to hold the panel, and then used my cordless router to go around all the edges with a 45-degree chamfer bit. And I just gave it a small chamfer to give it a really clean, subtle, modern look. Then it was time for the finish, and this time I decided to try Mahoney's all-natural walnut oil. So this is 100% California walnut oil, and it's food safe. So it's similar in the way it looks and behaves to a Danish oil, but is a lot less toxic and nasty. So I really like this. I'll probably use it again at some point. I'm going to use 3/8" lag bolts to attach the legs to the top. And I used a speed square to make sure that the legs were perpendicular to the edge of the top. And then clamped the legs temporarily to hold them. Used a hole punch to mark the center of the recessed circles. Used a smaller bit to drill a lead hole, and then went back with a 3/8" bit to drill a hole through the concrete and through the top. Then used a Forstner bit to drill out matching holes on the underside of the top, put the bolts in, and used washers and a nut to attach them. And the washers are going to give me some extra surface area that make this a stronger attachment.
I think this experiment turned out pretty well. As you saw, the concrete legs are totally sturdy and the bench is solid. So very happy about that. I also really like how the pastel colors came out in the concrete. If you want to see me experiment more with colored concrete, leave a comment below, let me know, and maybe let me know what colors you'd like to see, and we'll have a little fun with that. And as always, make sure you hit that like button to let YouTube know that you like this video. It really does help me out. Hit that subscribe button and the bell button next to it to get notified about all my future builds. That's it for this time, and I'll see you next time.